what is the definition and what are the characteristics or categories of a mujtahid according to sacred law. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What is the definition and categories of a mujtahid according to sacred law? First and foremost, a mujtahid. What is a mujtahid? A mujtahid is an Islamic scholar who has achieved the highest level of expertise in interpreting sacred law. And when we say highest level of expertise here, the mujtahid is qualified to derive legal rulings, so ahkam, from the primary sources of Islam, so the Quran, Sunnah, and other sources of sacred law, which we learn about in the subject known as usulul fiqh. And they can also apply legal maxims, right, qawaidul fiqhiyya, in order to derive understanding or to describe sacred law or even to derive sacred law as well. This is, in its absolute sense, what we refer to as a mujtahid. And in its absolute sense, we refer to it more particularly as a mujtahid mutlaq, an unrestricted mujtahid. What this means is that this particular scholar derives his information, his knowledge, his results, or his conclusions directly from the primary sources without relying on the opinions or the legal frameworks of any other scholars or from any secondary sources. So such a scholar wouldn't refer to the books of fiqh, for example, or to the books of usulul fiqh, for example, or to the books of mustalahul hadith, for example. This scholar would be directly capable of applying himself or herself on the primary sources, so the Quran and the Sunnah, and be able to derive principles therefrom and create, right, metaphorically speaking, of course, because Allah is the lawmaker, but to derive the laws from scratch based on a legal framework that he or she is able to derive and firmly plant themselves. However, this is not the only category of a mujtahid, right? So in an unrestricted sense, we can see some of the mujtahidun are the likes of Imamuna Ash-Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imamuna Abu Hanifa, Imamuna Malik ibn Anas, Imamuna Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahumullah ta'ala. Those are four examples. They're also the eponyms of the four schools of sacred law within traditional Sunni Islam. But there were others as well who were also independent mujtahidun, or as we said, mujtahid mutlaq. However, there are subcategories of the mujtahid, or the restricted type of mujtahid, which is referred to in Arabic as the mujtahid muqayyad. This mujtahid is restricted in the sense that, yes, he still derives his information from the primary sources, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, Qiyas. However, he would apply himself within the legal framework of an extant school of law. So, for example, the students of Imam Shafi'i, known in the Shafi'i school as the Ashabul Wujuh, the scholars within the madhab, they are often categorized as mujtahid muqayyad. So they are able to independently derive law from the primary sources, but they work within the legal framework of the Shafi'i madhab, and as such, they derive laws that we can still categorize as being of the Shafi'i madhab. So this is mujtahid fil madhab, right? Another way of expressing it is it is a mujtahid within the madhab. Now the mujtahid within a school uses that framework, as we said, that has been founded by the eponym of the particular madhab in question, of an extant school, and he then builds upon that. So this is, in a very broad sense, the two types of mujtahid. You get more, right? There are mujtahidun fil fan. You get a mujtahid in a particular subject. So he's not an expert in all sciences per se, but he's an expert, an independent scholar within one particular branch of sacred law. For example, mufassir, right? Or he's an expert in rijal, so the knowledge of the biographies of the narrators of ahadith. But more importantly, I think a lot of the questions about ijtihad and who is a mujtahid would stem from some of the misconceptions within society in relation to the qualifications of a mujtahid. So let's look at that in brief, inshallah. A mujtahid must have the following qualifications, right? Number one, he must have mastery of the Arabic language. The reason why I'm specifically outlining this is because we live in the information age, and as such, it is quite ubiquitous for people to say, I'm a qualified scholar, or I'm an independent scholar, or I've done my research, etc. But it would be good for us to understand when it comes to a truly independent scholar in the strictest sense of the word, there are certain strict qualifications, and then subcategories or less qualified scholars would have to fulfill some of these qualifications, at least to some extent, in order to be considered qualified to do independent research or independent scholarly application within the framework of sacred law. So what are they? Mastery of the Arabic language, as we said. This is to minimize the possibility of misinterpreting any of the primary sources. So revelation is a textual evidence for all intents and purposes. As far as we are concerned, we receive our guidance from the Quran and from the Sunnah, and thus we rely on textual interpretation. So a mastery of the Arabic language is critically important, just so that the person does not fall into gross errors as far as misinterpreting revelation is concerned. Number two, they need to have a profound knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah and the circumstances surrounding the revelation of each verse and hadith. So the asbabul wurud in the case of hadith, and the asbabul nuzul in the case of ayat, which don't restrict the meanings of those texts, but rather provide insight as to the application of those texts in the primary sense. So together with full knowledge of the Quranic and hadith commentaries and control of all the interpretive techniques that we already covered in the first point, which is mastery of the Arabic language. Further, the person requires specialized knowledge in the fields of hadith and in the fields of fiqh. So mustalahul hadith, ulumul hadith, usulul fiqh, these sciences, which consist of various branches, they provide a scholar with interpretative tools. So the scholar now has a framework with which to go to the primary sources and derive the law. The assessment of narrators is an example. Often people, they find a hadith and they say, look, I'm going to practice on this particular hadith because I believe that the Prophet ﷺ said this, and therefore this is what should be done. But this is an oversimplification of something that's quite complex, because the mujtahid, first and foremost, assesses the authenticity of the particular hadith in question, then looks at that hadith in light of other related material, whether that be material from the Quran or from hadith itself, and then looks at the interpretations of the scholars in relation to that material, and applies the rules pertaining to interpretation, Arabic language, and then derives his own conclusion about that particular hadith. So it's not as simple as finding a hadith, reading it, gaining a particular understanding, and saying that this is my way or my practice. This is an oversimplification, and Allah knows best. Further, the mujtahid requires knowledge of the opinions of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and the great Imams. Now remember, we said that the mujtahid, in the strictest sense, relies on primary sources only. However, just because they derive their knowledge from the primary sources does not mean that they completely ignore secondary sources. It is essential to be completely aware of secondary sources so as not to, number one, recreate the wheel, as we would say, and number two, so that we don't end up with conclusions that go against scholarly consensus, or what we refer to as ijma'. Because when there's an ijma', when there's a scholarly consensus around any particular issue, this creates an impenetrable fortress around that issue, wherein other interpretations that contradict it will not be accepted, and Allah knows best. It also requires, or mujtahid also requires, knowledge of the science of juridical analogy, right? Qiyas. Analogy is, applying the ruling of an older case onto a newer case because of a ratio legis that they share in common, and as simple as that may sound, the conditions and the types and the application thereof is quite complex, and it requires in-depth knowledge, especially of the science known as usulul fiqh, or Islamic legal theory. Then further, one mujtahid rather would require knowledge of one's society and public interests. So this is about maslaha, knowing what is in the best interests of society, knowing what would be appropriate for society. And while we are not speaking about this directly, but this also sheds some light on the importance of consulting your local scholars. So wherever you are from, there's a trend, because of, again, the information age, to follow scholars who basically are now international celebrities. They are well known around the world, and mashallah, probably because they're doing great work. And that's all good. But often fatwa and rulings, they have a certain level of flexibility within them. Not all rulings, but some rulings. So if one applies a fatwa from, for example, a predominantly Muslim country onto a minority Muslim situation, then you may end up with more problems than you've solved. So because of this, it is necessary for people to generally always consult their local scholars, even though they can consult other scholars as well. But there's wisdom, there's hikmah in consulting local scholars, so as to take the maslaha, the best public interest of your own society, into consideration, and Allah knows best. And then ultimately, the mujtahid should have general knowledge of the objectives of the sharia, right? What we refer to as the maqasid of the sharia. Now, maqasid, or the Sharia's objectives, is again one of those topics that has unfortunately, received quite negative reception within traditional Islam because of its abuse. Meaning, often, you have people with ulterior motives employing certain traditional methodologies like maqasid, like the objectives of the Sharia, but for a motive that is not congruent with the framework of the Sharia. So when we speak about maqasid here, we are speaking about the traditional, the classical sense of the objectives of the Sharia, which wouldn't, generally speaking, be incongruent with the basis of the Sharia, meaning the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas, and Allah knows best. And then finally, it is necessary that a mujtahid have a high degree of intelligence, personal piety, and the person needs to have a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as having imbibed the Islamic virtues of compassion, of courtesy, of modesty, etc. A scholar who has fulfilled these conditions can be considered to be a mujtahid, depending on the level of attainment of these sciences, an independent scholar within sacred law, and is therefore not obliged or even permitted, depending again on the level of knowledge, to follow an existing authoritative madhab. So some imams were saying this when they forbade the followers. Like Imam Shafi'i, for example, would say that his followers must follow the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and not his words, right? If you find a hadith that contradicts my words, and I'm paraphrasing, then throw my words against the wall, follow the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And ordinary Muslims would read such statements thinking that, okay, so if I find a hadith and it contradicts the opinions of Imam Shafi'i, then I should discard the opinions of Imam Shafi'i and follow this hadith. But this message, this instruction, is not meant for an ordinary Muslim who has no knowledge, or very little knowledge rather, of the intricate sciences that we've discussed. But rather, this is meant for Imam Shafi'i's own students and the Ashabul Wujuh, the scholars within the madhab who works within that framework laid down by Imam Shafi'i, and they are capable of actually discerning whether a particular hadith is, number one, authentic, whether it has a particular explanation, what the scholars said about it, what other ahadith say in relation to it, etc. And they would then be able to see whether the teacher, Imam Shafi'i, perhaps made a mistake or didn't take this into consideration, and they would act accordingly. And we see this in the Shafi'i madhab, and we see this in other madhahib as well. Often you would find, for example, the Shafi'i madhab would say A, and then the spokesman for the Shafi'i madhab, namely Imam Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he would still say, look, this is what the madhab says, but according to my own preference, this is my opinion. So he still speaks on behalf of the madhab, but at the same time he offers his opinion as a separate point, because he's also an independent scholar and Allah knows best. So for that reason, we shouldn't just take statements like very general statements and think that they apply to us as well, especially when they come from the great Mujtahidun scholars saying things like, discard my words and take the words of the Prophet ﷺ. There's a context to that, and there's a specific target audience that it is meant for. So for the much greater number of scholars whose expertise has not reached such, high levels, it may be possible to become a mujtahid within the madhab. It may even be possible for a scholar to become a mujtahid within a particular bab or particular chapter of Islamic sacred law. And this would be up to the scholars to decide. And therein he can become an independent scholar. But generally speaking, what we're sitting with in contemporary Islam is that most Muslims and most scholars work within the framework of a madhab, or perhaps more than one madhab in certain instances, but within the framework of a madhab. As for the independent mujtahidun, Allah knows best, but it appears that we don't have independent mujtahidun any longer to the level of the great mujtahidun of the past, but we certainly do have experts within particular fields and experts within particular subsections of the law. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So I hope that has answered the question, inshallah, about what is a mujtahid and what are the different categories of a mujtahid.
La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.